This program is a video presentation via Zoom of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. Founded in 1951, the Roundtable hosts monthly presentations at a location near Washington, D.C., more recently at the Fort Myer Officers Club. For more information, go to www.CWRTDC.org.
Our speaker tonight is indeed Jon Matteson, who has a history degree from Princeton, a law degree from Harvard, and a PhD in English from Columbia. Mr. Matteson has worked as a litigator in San Francisco and in Raleigh, North Carolina. He has never really knew who he was until he put his law books in storage and decided to read good books. Now, he says it has worked out pretty well because, as you'll hear, he's a distinguished professor of English at John Jay College in the City University of New York, where he teaches in the honors program. His first book was the story of Outcast, the story of Louisa May Alcott and her father, Bronson Alcott, with inspiration supplied by his daughter. Mr. Matteson also admits that Eden's Outcast, which surprised him and others by winning a Pulitzer Prize in 2008. He was just as delighted with the response to his second book, The Lives of Margaret Fuller, a biography which came out in 2012, and his annotated edition of Little Women, published in 2015. He's looking forward to the response of this book, which he is going to speak to us about, A Worse Place Than Hell, How the Civil War Battle of Fredericksburg Changed the Nation, which was published in February 2021. And I heard him talk about this book before. I'm really looking forward to it because it's, we've had Frank O'Reilly, we talk a lot about the Battle of Fredericksburg, but this looks at from the perspective of three of the individuals who because of my interest in Civil War medicine, I got interested in was of course, Louisa May Alcott and her family, and Oliver Wendell Holmes because of his father. Okay, so I give you Jon Matteson.
Jon, thank you very, very much. And I want to give my thanks as well to everyone who's joining us this evening. It's just fantastic to see so many people taking an interest. And I want to say that to merely say that I'm honored this evening is a real understatement, because for someone like me who has been excited about the Civil War for now almost 50 years. This occasion for me is really nothing short of a dream come true. So I thank you heartily, and I really hope that my remarks this evening will repay both your interest and your kindness. Just a few preliminaries before I get into the meat of my discussion. First of all, I would mention that if you like what you hear this evening and would like to purchase a copy of A Worse Place Than Hell, and you'd like to have a signed book plate, you can get that by emailing me a direct request at matteson151@earthlink.net. The address is already up in the chat box. So anyway, please feel free in that regard. Also, this afternoon, I had a great conversation with Kurt, and he explained to me that quite a few of the members of the roundtable are attorneys. And so I thought I would take the liberty of quickly putting in a plug for a new book by the fellow who actually was my undergraduate thesis advisor. He's been doing this longer than I have. His name is James Oakes, and he published a book also with Norton called The Crooked Path to Abolition, Abraham Lincoln and the Anti-Slavery Constitution. It's not a terribly long book, but it's tremendously insightful. And so I commend it to your attention. Also, if you don't want to patronize, the mega booksellers like Barnes & Noble or Amazon, I would just love it if you would consider buying my volume from louisamayalcott.org, which is the website of Louisa May Alcott's Orchard House in Concord, Massachusetts. And they've been nothing but kind and generous to me for almost 20 years now, going back before the publication of Eden's Outcasts. So if you go to louisamayalcott.org, click the bar that says online store and look for books about the Alcotts and their world, you will find A Worse Place Than Hell there. So anyway, that does it for the prelims, and I'll start talking for real now. The writing of history is, for me, a personal matter. I mean this in more than one sense. The first is that through my writing, I tend to develop what at least feels to me like a really intimate and sympathetic attachment to my subjects. Before I started writing books, I did work much closer to the typical English professor thing. You're writing articles that focus on ideas and theories and trying consciously to exclude emotion at every turn. Well, I don't write like that anymore, and I don't want to. What my work as a biographer has shown me is that the best writing is a joint venture that involves both head and heart. With the teachings of Ralph Waldo Emerson firmly in mind, I've tried to understand thought and sympathy as two sides of the same coin, and to see my writing as a continual tossing of that metaphysical dollar. If any of you have heard of me before my current book, it's because of the work that Jon mentioned in his introduction, Eden's Outcasts and the Lives of Margaret Fuller. And yes, I am a biographer. That's how I represent myself as a writer. And if you've looked at A Worse Place Than Hell, you know that my approach to Fredericksburg is distinctly biographical. Even when I try to write about charges and flanking maneuvers, I find myself almost instinctively narrowing my lens to focus on the experiences of individuals. One of the aspects of biography that I really love is that it constantly rejiggers and reinforms my understanding of history. Now, I appreciate the kind of history that explores large forces and mass movements, but I think something really wonderful happens when, amidst all of the powerful and the political, one stops to remember the personal. In A Worse Place Than Hell, my hope was to break away from some of the conventions and cliches of military writing and to restore a kind of life and immediacy to our knowledge of the battle. And so my book tells detailed stories about people. An Army chaplain who laid down his Bible, picked up a gun, and crossed the Rappahannock with the 19th Massachusetts. A Confederate artillery officer who stalled the advance of a third of Burnside's army with his brilliant use of a single cannon. A Brooklyn carpenter who happened to have an older brother who wrote unforgettable poems. A young Pennsylvania blacksmith whose march toward Marie's Heights would be his first and only experience of battle. And if we could call up perhaps a slide from the PowerPoint at this point, I'd be grateful. Good, there we go. The scene that you're looking at now is, as the caption informs us, it was the last major attack of December 13th, 1862, in which General A.A. Humphreys urged his men toward destruction, all the while singing a tune incongruously titled Gay and Happy. You can see him on horseback in the middle distance of the illustration. Someone you can't see is the blacksmith I just mentioned. He was John Surrey of the 133rd Pennsylvania, and I'll have more to say about him in just a moment. In writing A Worse Place Than Hell, I also wanted to see what would happen if I looked at a Civil War battle, not primarily as a military event, but in terms of its cultural impact. How did the future of the country change in terms of its law, its literature, and its popular myths because the battle was fought? So I've tried to answer this question with regard to Fredericksburg by considering its impact on 5 principal figures whose stories I will spend the balance of my remarks this evening discussing. I don't have a picture of that blacksmith I just mentioned because none is known to exist. I do, however, have a picture of the nurse who cared for him after he arrived, shot through the lung, at the Union Hotel Hospital in Georgetown. If we could have the next image. Yeah, this is Louisa May Alcott, the future author of Little Women, Louisa, as many of you may know, grew up as a tomboy, the hot-headed, rebellious daughter of a placid, somewhat ne'er-do-well transcendental philosopher, Bronson Alcott, who had tried to raise his four daughters in an atmosphere of moral perfection and had not quite succeeded. When the war began, Louisa was 28. She wished that she could be a man so that she could join the recruits who marched and drilled on the village green of her hometown of Concord, Massachusetts. Her one avenue into service was through nursing. A few years earlier, she had cared for her dying sister Lizzie and had acquired some skill in attending to a patient. But there was no immediate chance for Louisa May Alcott in 1861 to join the Army. The head of the Union Nursing Corps, Dorothea Dix, did not want the wards of her hospitals turned into hunting grounds for dewy young maidens in search of slightly damaged husbands. She therefore stipulated that no woman need apply as a nurse until the age of 30, by which time said person would be presumed to be a confirmed spinster. Louisa's 30th birthday fell on November 29th, 1862. She sent in her application without delay, and on December 11th boarded a train in Boston in the direction of Washington. She arrived at the Union Hotel Hospital 2 evenings later, hours after the sun had set on the most terrible day of fighting at Fredericksburg. It took 3 days for the first casualties from Fredericksburg to arrive at her hospital. So it was a relatively placid interval in which Alcott was able to settle in and get her bearings. But the morning of the 16th erupted into tumult, and here's how I describe it in A Worse Place Than Hell. As the gray light dawned on Alcott's third day at the hospital, she was jolted into awareness by a loud knock at her door and the terse announcement, they've come, hurry up, ladies, you're wanted." Groggy and disoriented, Alcott thought for a moment that Lee's army had reached the capital. A glance out the window dispelled her confusion. In the street below stood a great clot of vehicles that looked like market carts. Instead, they were some 40 ambulances disgorging their shattered human cargo. Above the din, Alcott heard the voice of a 6-year-old boy who had recently escaped slavery by passing through the Union line. "They were coming," the boy shouted, "heaps of them." He was especially fascinated by one body that had been brought in dead. As the boy darted away, Alcott thought she heard him singing like a bird. As she descended to the ward, she was greeted by an appalling stench and a stunning influx of ruined humanity, some on stretchers, some in the arms of comrades, some faltering along on crutches. The dead man lay covered, a nurse duly recording his name before sending him to the dead house. Those who could sit lined the walls. Those who could not sit covered the floor. In the hotel's former ballroom, 40 beds were hastily made. Ragged and pale, a handful of men stood by the large stove, their calves encased in drying mud. Their coats had either been lost or rendered useless, so they pulled blankets around them to keep off the cold. The bandages they had worn for days looked filthy. Gaunt and bewildered, the dreary little group silently attested to the enormity of Burnside's blunder. Louisa May Alcott's first weapon in the struggle against slavery had been the needle she had used to sew uniforms for the Concord volunteers. She was now given a new one, a block of coarse brown soap. "Wash as fast as you can," she was told. That seemed all right, but another task appalled her. She had also been told to order her patients to disrobe. The job of viewing and scrubbing several dozen naked lords of creation, as she delicately called them, left her all but speechless. Even months later, she could only sputter that the experience had been, really. Yet she remembered that she had come to do as she was told. No time for nonsense now. She drowned her scruples in her washbowl, clutched her soap manfully, and plunged ahead. John Surrey did not arrive until a day or two after the largest quantity of wounded. He'd been delayed because, repeatedly, he had given up his place in the evacuation to a man who seemed more grievously wounded than he. Alcott saw in Surrey a remarkable specimen of manhood, so impressive in his quiet dignity that she dared not to approach him for several days. She finally overcame her shyness one day when she passed the private's bed and noticed silent tears running down his face. It was a new sight for her. Men in the wards groaned or cursed or silently toughed it out. They never cried. But Surrey's tears were just the solvent needed to melt Louisa's reluctance to speak to him, She gathered his head into her arms as if it were a child's and said to him, "Let me help you bear it, John." Here's how she described the scene that followed. "Never on any human countenance have I seen so swift and beautiful a look of gratitude, surprise, and comfort as that which answered me more eloquently than the whispered, 'Thank you, ma'am. This is right good. This is what I wanted.' Then why not ask for it before? I didn't like to be a trouble. You seem so busy, and I could manage to get on alone. You shall not want it any more, John." Thereafter, Louisa spent as much time with John Surrey as her other duties permitted. While doctors cleaned and probed his wounds, she held his hand. When that painful work was done, she washed his face, brushed his hair, and laid a small knot of flowers on his pillow. Then, the day after Christmas, after taking a swallow of water, Surrey said to her, "Thank you, madam. I think I must be marching on." A few hours later, Surrey was dead. In her fictionalized account of his passing, Alcott wrote that she held his hand as he died, and that he had gripped her hand so tightly that his fingers left 4 white marks across its back. Alcott's nursing service ended only 6 weeks later, cut short by a nearly fatal, actually only after 6 weeks total, I should say, cut short by a nearly fatal illness. The book she wrote about her brief time in the Army, Hospital Sketches, featured John Surrey's story. Alcott privately called Surrey the hero of the book and credited its success to him. And the book was indeed Alcott's first commercial success, the book without which no one would ever have asked her to write Little Women. Moreover, the realism of Hospital Sketches showed Alcott, who had previously written lurid and melodramatic tales for the penny press, that she could take scenes from her own life and turn them into compelling fiction. For reasons both practical and stylistic, Little Women would never have been written if not for the Battle of Fredericksburg and for Private John Surrey. And because Little Women is the oldest and one of the most influential American books among children's literary classics, it is hard to imagine just how different our national juvenile literature would be if Louisa May Alcott had never gone to Georgetown. A Worse Place Than Hell also concerns a second nurse in Washington, though one without an official commission in Lincoln's army. Walt Whitman, the now immortal author of Leaves of Grass, was deeply demoralized by the outbreak of the war. Unable at first to find a constructive role in saving the Union, he took to spending his evenings at Pfaff's, a literally underground dive bar in lower Manhattan, bogged down in a period that he later referred to as his quicksand years. Up until Fredericksburg, actually, the Whitman who took an active role in the war was not Walt, but George, the poet's younger brother, who had joined the 51st New York Volunteer Infantry as a private and would march onto the field at Fredericksburg as a freshly promoted captain. George had earned his new shoulder strap at Antietam, where he had led his men in the famous taking of Burnside's Bridge. His luck was not so good at Fredericksburg, where a shell exploded at his feet, sending a little shard of metal flying directly toward his face. 3 days later, at home in Brooklyn, Walt Whitman read in the New York Herald of the wounding of G.W. Whitmore. Correctly divining that Whitmore was actually his brother George, Whitman hastened to Washington to search for him. Passing through Philadelphia, he had his wallet stolen. He searched the nation's capital for 2 days and nights. Then, by chance, he ran into 2 old friends, one of whom gave him some money, and the other of whom procured him a pass to the Army's camp at Falmouth, Virginia. There he found George, whose wound turned out not to be serious. Walt's visit to the front and the sight of so many men in need touched him profoundly. Likely on the same day that John Surrey marched on to his eternal rest, Whitman experienced an epiphany. We'll just, I'll wait until the Whitman slide is up. There we go. Thank you. Okay, we'll get it. I know it tends to be a little jumpy. I'll just wait. There we go. That's fantastic. So there he found George, whose wound turned out not to be serious. Walt's visit to the front and the sight of so many men in need touched him profoundly. Likely on the same day that John Surrey marched on to his eternal rest, Whitman experienced an epiphany that I describe in my book. Early one morning, very likely the day after Christmas, Whitman's meanderings took him to a hospital tent. 3 corpses lay outside on stretchers, each with a blanket laid over him. Whitman paused over one of the men and raised the cloth. The voice that Whitman uses in his notebook changes at the instant when his eyes fall upon the dead soldier's benign and tender face, shifting from desultory prose to trademark Whitmanesque verse. Quote, 3 dead men lying, each with a blanket spread over him. I lift up one corner of a blanket and look at the young man's face, calm and yellow. 'Tis strange. Young man, I think this face of yours, the face of my dead Christ. In my book, I add, the slain Christ on whom Whitman gazed could not be resurrected, but failing that, he might still possess the power to redeem. It may not be supposing too much to think that Whitman's shift in tone also signaled a small spiritual conversion. At Falmouth, the stubbornly resurgent life that Whitman saw emerging from the desolation called him toward his own rebirth. It was in Falmouth that Whitman jotted down a draft of his poem Quicksand Years, in which he regretted the time and energy he had lost at Faf's. And it was in Falmouth that he first felt that empty phase of his life coming to an end. After his stay at Falmouth, Whitman did not go back to New York. Instead, he went only as far as Washington. There, he found himself a low-level government job and spent his time away from work, bringing presence and companionship to the wounded men in the hospitals. He filled up notebooks with his charitable shopping lists, a jar of jelly for Joe Armstrong, preserved peaches for Clinton Mincy. Walt stood by at amputations, ready to lend a hand. One of these surgeries was performed on a friend, Louis Brown. Before the war, some of Whitman's poetry had been so erotically charged as to spark scandal. In the hospitals, amid all the broken humanity, Whitman arrived at a different appreciation of the human and a higher understanding of love. My book puts it this way. Whitman's poems make liberal use of the word perfect. Early in his poetic career, he was all but obsessed with the beauty of the human form and with its erotic idealization. He wrote of perfect men formed from the bodies of perfect women, demanded, quote, perfect men and women out of his love spendings, unquote, and declared, quote, if 1,000 perfect men were to appear, it would not amaze me, unquote. But in the hospitals, Whitman was surrounded with tens of thousands of imperfections. Every day he spent there, he saw his dreams of physical splendor crushed and mutilated. None of these shocks was more jarring than the surgical maiming of Louis Brown. Yet, as he noted, quote, the fearful suffering, amputations, and weary sickness, unquote, brought people, quote, very, very close, unquote. Because of their various woundings, Whitman loved Brown and his fellow patients all the more. In the emotion that we call love, the ancient Greeks observed not one feeling, but 3. Philos, the love that unites brothers, eros, or sexual desire, and agape, the selfless, charitable love that Paul describes in his letters to the Corinthians. Whitman was never an unkind person. Still, in his pre-war writings, eros crowded agape into the margins. The hospitals had had no discernible effect on Whitman's sexual drive. Nevertheless, the fulcrum of his loving shifted. Amid the broken bodies, compassion deepened. The need for perfection receded. He cared for worldly things less than ever. The love of comrades that had once been chiefly fueled by erotic dreams was now equally sustained by a need to care for the helpless and to strengthen the weak. Agape had risen to the fore. And the crowning beauty of it was that the shift had begun with an act of Philos, Whitman's journey to Fredericksburg in search of his wounded brother. If Whitman had not come to Washington, he would never have written his influential collection, Drum Taps. He would also never have conceived his worshipful regard for President Lincoln, and thus his most popular poem, O Captain, My Captain, and his great When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, possibly the greatest of American elegies, would never have come to be. Despite the fact that Whitman had published 3 iterations of Leaves of Grass before the war, he insisted that the true Leaves of Grass would never have come into being without his experiences of war. Both as a man and as a poet, Fredericksburg transformed Walt Whitman. And we'll move the slides forward now if we can. To go with my 2 nurses, Worse Place Than Hell also features the stories of 2 combat soldiers, one Union and one Confederate. The Union man you see before you, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., a captain in the 20th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. Like Olcott, Holmes Jr. was the child of a famous man. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. was a respected poet and novelist, in addition to being a professor of anatomy at the Harvard Medical School. Indeed, my first chapter begins not with a description of Jr., but rather with Sr., and I'll read that to you now. The governor, as his elder son was pleased to call him, worked cheerfully among corpses. The work that fed his family occurred inside the old Harvard Medical School on North Grove Street in Boston. There, as the early afternoon light shone through a single tall window and filtered through clouds of tobacco smoke, a small team of assistants would look on as the diminutive doctor strode into the demonstrators' room and walked smilingly toward the day's cadaver. Then Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., professor of anatomy, would pause to catch his breath. Plagued by asthma, he typically called upon a janitor to help him climb the long flight of stairs from the street below, and the noxious haze that filled the place did his lungs no great service. After taking a few moments to compose himself, the doctor would prepare the cadaver and make the other final preparations for his lecture. Meanwhile, some 300 boisterous students tumbled into the steep aisles of the adjoining amphitheater. As the students settled in, Holmes's orderlies would bring in the body on a board and lay it on a revolving table, veiled in a clean white sheet. The professor then would appear, greeted by shouts and applause of a kind that might, in a different place, have heralded the entrance of a famous actor. Dr. Holmes delighted in teaching. His lectures, patient and precise, were enlivened with puns and anecdotes, clothing the dry bones, someone said, with poetic imagery. An assistant, Thomas Dwight, recalled that the professor let no opportunity for jest escape him, yet the humor somehow did not seem to disrespect the poor, dissected corpse that had so recently enveloped a soul. Respect for the patient and love for the subject, these were the feelings that Dr. Holmes brought to his craft. Standing at the nexus of two worlds, explaining death to life, introducing the living to the dead, he daily imparted these values to his students for them to carry through their careers. What Dr. Holmes wanted for his eldest child and namesake was a more complicated matter. So Holmes Jr. is in some ways the central figure of my book, and Fredericksburg, and the influence of Fredericksburg on him is, I find, especially intriguing. Some of you likely know that Holmes was seriously wounded both at Ball's Bluff and in the West Woods at Antietam. His participation at Fredericksburg is far less noted because, in truth, it was practically non-existent. When the 20th Massachusetts crossed the Rappahannock into the street fight at Fredericksburg, and when they were mowed down 2 days later below Marie's Heights, Holmes was not with them. He was across the river in a hospital tent, battling a severe case of dysentery. But if Holmes's own words are to be taken seriously, his absence at Fredericksburg weighed more heavily on his soul than did his presence at any of the fights that had gone before. In a letter to his mother, Holmes called staying behind, quote, a feeling worse than the anxiety of danger, unquote. And he wept when his regiment moved up without him. Quote, oh, what self-reproaches I have gone through, unquote, he said. More than 20 years later, Holmes gave a speech on Memorial Day that broadly implied that he had crossed the river with his comrades. He could somehow not entirely admit that on this occasion he had failed. The episode led Captain Holmes to think long and hard about the concept of duty. Just when could one say that he had done enough, either as a soldier or as a citizen? His reflections on duty turned darker and more painful in 1864 during the Wilderness and Spotsylvania campaign, when the slaughter intensified and Holmes watched comrades literally going mad from the physical and emotional strain. I should pause to mention as well that there's a very interesting reversal that takes place between Holmes Sr. and Jr. during the course of the war. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. starts off as being very diffident as far as the Union cause is concerned. He doesn't make public pronouncements. He feels that other people are better suited to that kind of speech. And so he remains somewhat on the sidelines for a while his son, Oliver Wendell Jr., is quite eager to involve himself in the fight. And then the positions gradually change. Wendell Jr. sees virtually all of his friends either killed or maimed. He's, as I mentioned, wounded several times in his own right, and becomes kind of an embodiment of Melville's line from his poem on Shiloh, what so like a bullet can undeceive. And so Holmes Jr. becomes more and more cynical and skeptical about the war, the ability of the Union to win it, and so forth. Meanwhile, his father's gradually becoming a super patriot. He feels that he sent his son to war, and that it is now his duty to beat the drums and try to persuade into the service as many other young men as he can. And so he gives these very fiery, patriotic speeches at the same time that his son is falling deeper and deeper into doubt as to the cause and as to his ability to see it through. So to return to my written remarks. The day after the appalling struggle at the Bloody Angle, where the bodies piled up half a dozen deep, Holmes toured the battlefield. Near despair, he wrote to his parents that he faced a grim choice: either quit the army, or if he stayed, go either to the madhouse or to the cemetery. As I explain in my book, Holmes's ideas about leaving the army did not go down well with his patriotic father. Quote, and this is back to my book. Back in Boston, the governor was in no mood for philosophizing. The letter he sent his son is lost, but if one may judge from his son's response, the elder Holmes was furious with his son's decision. The last 3 years had transformed the politically diffident doctor into a vociferous patriot. In part, he had undergone the change to protect his son, writing poems and giving speeches that had then seemed like his most effective means to rally other young men to the Union's cause. The governor had wanted to bring victory as soon as possible and to bring his son home safe. The previous summer, he had stood before the most powerful men in Boston and pledged his willingness to have the Union defend itself to the last woman and child. But now his own son was leaving the fight that the doctor had urged so many to join. Did the boy wish to make a fool and a hypocrite of him? No. Wendell must stay and fight. This message, or something like it, Dr. Holmes must have sent to Wendell. The irony was great. Trapped by the rhetoric that he had first adopted in hopes of saving him, the doctor now demanded that his son continue to expose himself to mayhem. Wendell wrote back with indignation. With stunning forthrightness, he called his father stupid. The doctor had somehow gotten the idea that Wendell meant to resign before the campaign was over. He had also apparently imputed cowardice, for Wendell hotly wrote, quote, "I must say I dislike such a misunderstanding, so discreditable to my feeling of soldierly honor, when I don't believe there was a necessity for it," unquote. His father had evidently further nettled him by trying to debate his motives for wanting to come home. His reasons, Wendell wrote testily, were, quote, "satisfactory to myself. If I am satisfied, I don't see why anyone else has a call to be otherwise," unquote. He also hinted at a reason that ought to have felt sufficient to anyone. He was on the verge of mental and physical collapse, quote, "I am convinced from my late experience that if I can stand the wear and tear, body and mind, of regimental duty, that it is a greater strain on both than I am called on to endure." Again, that word duty arose. It lay at the very fulcrum of Wendell's thoughts now. The allusion to his mental strain was also telling. He was seeing the same phenomenon that had caught Whitman's notice, the mass of men whom combat was driving simply insane. He was soon to write home, quote, "I tell you, many a man has gone crazy since this campaign began, from the terrible pressure on mind and body." Holmes felt the clouds of his own potential madness gathering near. He had to escape them if he could. So after the war, Holmes's first great contribution to American law is a work of scholarship that he publishes in 1881. It's titled simply The Common Law. And some of the attorneys listening may be familiar with it. That book virtually begins with his immortal pronouncement, "The life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience." Holmes's study in the common law includes the most important discussion of legal duty in American law up to that time, and that discussion remains foundational to this day. And at least some of it began in a hospital tent at Fredericksburg. The sole Confederate among my quintet of leading figures is someone, thanks, who, I'll start that again. The sole Confederate among my quintet of leading figures is someone who has interested me since early adolescence, John Pelham of Jeb Stuart's Horse Artillery. He's been described as the perfect Confederate idol, a complex designation at our moment in history, to be sure. Pelham was young, handsome, profoundly courageous, and preternaturally gifted as an artillery tactician, a wonderful person in everything except his pro-slavery, pro-secession politics. At Fredericksburg, he became famous, holding off a third of Burnside's army at a critically important hour with a single cannon. Rather than tell you a lot about him, I've taken just a couple of excerpts from the book. The first that I'll read coming from my chapter on Pelham at Fredericksburg. As this excerpt begins, Pelham and his gun crew have already opened fire on the Union left and are receiving fearsome return fire from Union batteries. His commanding officer, Major General Stuart, has started to become deeply anxious about the risk Pelham is taking. With a nonchalance that imperfectly masked his mounting worry, Stuart sent a courier to Pelham with a simple message, quote, "I want to know how he's getting on," unquote. The messenger found Pelham still astride his horse, superintending the fire of his cannon. His answer was almost as terse as his commander's query, quote, "Go back and tell General Stuart I am doing first rate," unquote. But Pelham's luck was starting to erode. Minutes later, a Union shell detonated near the Napoleon, killing one man and wounding several others. Pelham dismounted and ran to one of the injured men. Jean Bacigalupo, the plucky teenage Creole, was jerking spasmodically, his chest torn open by a shell fragment. The wound was plainly mortal. Pelham attempted to comfort the boy and ordered 2 men to carry him to a surgeon. As the crew's casualties began to rise, another rider came forward from the line. It was Heros von Borka carrying a second message from Stuart. Pelham should withdraw, quote, if he thought the proper moment had arrived, unquote. The blonde major bristled, quote, "Tell the general I can hold my ground," unquote. A third communique arrived from Stuart, now emphatic. "Get back from destruction, you infernal gallant," I'll say that again. A third communique arrived from Stuart, now emphatic. "Get back from destruction, you infernal gallant fool, John Pelham." He was disobeying orders now. He heard the fear and love and rage commingled in the general's words, but they could not call him back. He could not retreat from the strangely beautiful terror he had summoned up around him. Not quite yet. It took 9 or 10 men to worm, sponge, load, aim, and fire the Napoleon. Pelham had lost so many gunners to death and injury that those who were left could not service the gun without him. As he had done in the past, Pelham dismounted and worked the piece alongside the remnants of his crew, courage verging on madness. At last, word came from Jackson himself. Pelham must retire. Jackson's aide-de-camp, James Power Smith, who brought the order, could not forget the scene. Quote, "I remember my ride across the field under fire to bear orders to Pelham to retire his guns, and how cool and quiet he was, in the open field in the center of the converging fire of 100 cannon. It was over. The corps commander had spoken, and the ammunition was either gone or nearly so. Pelham ordered his men to limber up and withdraw. Still under fire, begrimed with smoke and mud, the gunners rode back to the safety of Hamilton's Crossing. On a distant hill through field glasses, General Lee had observed the action. Who was it, he asked, who had so defied the Federals? Pelham's name was already well known to the famous commander. Upon hearing it again, he gave a reply that students of the war still know by heart. It is glorious to see such courage in one so young. From that scene of war, I'd like to move slightly back in time to a scene of peace. This takes place in the, I'm still actually with Pelham though, so we can, thank you. In the early autumn of 1862, Jeb Stuart, as many of you know, set up his quarters at a Federal-style mansion called the Bower at the invitation of a descendant of Martha Washington's family. So I'll read to you a few paragraphs from that rather idyllic passage in the life of Stuart's command. Von Borka remembered the trees and the water. Stuart's headquarters were, he recalled, situated on a hill under the shade of enormous oaks of primitive growth. One could follow the trees up to the Dandridge mansion, whose brick walls stood behind a well-tended garden. At the foot of the hill ran the creek, whose waters tumbled over cliffs and rocks, forming a cascade. Von Borcke wrote fondly of the rainbows emerging from the spray, quote, as the sun changed every falling drop into a ruby or a diamond, unquote. In the camp itself, under its fluttering battle flag, officers and men strolled about in the morning air and cleaned their guns as their enslaved servants stood over campfires to cook their breakfasts. For the soldiers, a scene of peace. For the men they held in servitude, another time of toil. All in all, Von Borcke recalled, the Bower gave, quote, a feeling of thankful happiness to the soldier, weary of the excitement, the hardships, and the anguish of war, unquote. H.B. McClellan primly remembered the Bower for its, quote, pleasant and ennobling social intercourse, unquote. One may assume, however, that some in the camp cared only secondarily about being ennobled. To be sure, Dandridge's home was one of grace and culture, but it also happened to be filled with eligible daughters and nieces who peered out through the curtains of their upstairs rooms to gaze upon the heroes of romance, fresh from the fields of glory. Stuart had a fondness for sentimental popular tunes. To indulge his musical cravings, he kept with him a small band of amateur musicians. They were led by a banjoist named Sam Sweeney, a mere private whom Stuart added to his staff, a position typically reserved for officers, on the strength of his musical talents alone. Pelham, for his part, added to his reputation for being, quote, as grand a flirt as ever lived, unquote. He focused his attentions on one of his host's daughters, whose name was the same as Pelham's old teasing West Point nickname, Sally. When a singing circle assembled around the Dandridge fireplace, Pelham held her hand. They promenaded through her father's rose garden and rode at night on the river. Stuart observed it all and wondered aloud whether romance might spoil Pelham's love for fighting. In this beautiful country, Pelham spent what seemed to be some of his happiest hours. At the evening soirees, Pelham was present too. Though his reactions to them are unrecorded, it is reasonable to suppose that he was grateful for the diversions. The beauty of the Bower, the attentions of Sally Dandridge, and Stuart's insistence on maintaining the highest of spirits all helped to keep the foul muck of war at a distance. And indeed, somehow, the stain and the chaos of the fighting seemed not yet to have fastened themselves to Stuart's command. For these weeks of grace, Pelham and his comrades could imagine themselves exempt from the consuming tragedy. Miles away in the darkness, the Army of the Potomac waited. But for now, these soldiers were happy as Sam Sweeney plucked his banjo and they sang songs under the stars. So I haven't left myself a great deal of time to talk about Arthur Fuller, but I will get to him in just a second. I just have a couple more words about Pelham, but you need not put the slide back if you don't want to. Pelham's long-term legacy is more ambiguous, I think, than those of Alcott, Whitman, and Holmes. Among the general public, Pelham's name sparks no recognition. Among Civil War aficionados, however, his fame remains secure. If one were to desire a beautiful, beguiling emblem of the Confederacy, one would need to look no further. However durable John Pelham's memory may or may not be, the moral conundrum that he embodies, the brave, noble man in service of a lamentable cause, will always be with us, precisely because it can never be satisfactorily resolved. So now, the last of my five, the chaplain, Arthur Fuller. Fuller is the member of the quintet whom you're least likely to know about. He was, like Holmes and Alcott, the member of a distinguished family. His father, Timothy, was a four-term congressman during the Monroe administration, friendly enough with John Quincy Adams to share a pew with him at church. Arthur's older sister was more famous still. One of the first great campaigners for women's rights in America, Margaret Fuller, wrote the foundational feminist text, Woman in the 19th Century, and was the first regular foreign correspondent, male or female, for an American newspaper covering the Roman Revolution of 1848-49 for Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. Arthur Fuller stood in the shadow of family expectations, and his life was clouded with misfortune. At the age of 10, he lost an eye in a freak accident. Thereafter, his parents could not agree on how to respond to his disability. His mother coddled him. His father, hoping to toughen the boy, had him go for barefoot runs in the Massachusetts snow. Arthur got into Harvard and studied for the Unitarian ministry. He did well in his profession, becoming the chaplain of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, where his father had once served as Speaker. Yet, in his own view, especially when compared with those of his father and sister, his achievements seemed paltry, and his physical frailty had kept him from living a life of action. In the legislature's chamber, he prayed that the Lord would, quote, help us really live, not merely to exist, but to live in deeds more than years, unquote. When the war came, Reverend Fuller was still looking for that real life. He sought it by joining the Army as the chaplain of the 16th Volunteer Massachusetts. He was with them on the peninsula and witnessed the Battle of the Monitor and the Virginia before being sent home, deathly ill with malaria. After a long, harrowing recovery, he rallied, and in late October 1862, rejoined his regiment. The regimental doctors, however, took one look at him and shook their heads. There was no way Fuller could travel with the regiment and hope to live. They arranged for him to accept a hospital chaplaincy, which would take him away from the dangers of the front. Fuller reluctantly accepted, and on December 7, 1862, came to Falmouth to bid farewell to the 16th for the last time. On the 10th of the month, he received his honorable discharge. But knowing that the battle was coming, he could not leave. He put on a captain's coat, slipped away from his regiment, and joined the 19th Massachusetts as they prepared to cross into Fredericksburg. I leave you with one more excerpt from my book. The setting is the intersection of Caroline and Hawk Streets as the 19th fights it out with Confederate sharpshooters. Moments later, an unfamiliar man in an officer's coat appeared at the side of Captain Monsignor Dunn, holding a musket. The man saluted and said, "Captain, I must do something for my country. What shall I do?" Captain Dunn studied the man for an instant. Surely this was no officer. "Who are you?" Dunn asked. The answer was calm and terse. "The chaplain of the 16th Massachusetts." Dunn scanned the minister's demeanor for signs of agitation. For skirmish duty, a soldier needed to be utterly in command of himself. A single excited man could distract and endanger all the others. This man showed no signs of rash impulse. He was, it seemed, perfectly cool and collected. Nevertheless, Dunn at first advised the chaplain not to go in, but the man was determined. "Well, all right then. Never a better time than the present," said Dunn. Fuller could take a place on the left of the company. The preacher did as he was told, finding a place about 15 feet away from the captain. In front of a grocery store, on the cold December afternoon, the half-blind malarial minister who had not fired a shot since his teens shouldered his gun and began to do what he could. It seemed to Captain Dunn that Chaplain Fuller had time to fire only once or twice. His armed defense of the Union lasted no more than 5 minutes. It is possible that in those brief minutes, Arthur Fuller found something that had always eluded him, that for an instant he ceased to be a coddled son, an overshadowed brother, or even the sickly, sometimes peevish chaplain who had too often lacked the health and strength to march with his men. One would hope that Fuller finally became, in his own mind, a victor over frailty and fear. But not even the soldiers with whom he was standing could know what he was thinking, and to the outward view, but for his purloined officer's coat, he looked more or less indistinguishable from the other embattled riflemen of the 19th Massachusetts, holding their ground and fighting for their lives. But to be just like them was the very thing that Fuller had wanted all along. Now, it's not possible for me to argue that Arthur Fuller left a noticeable I'll say that again. It's not really possible for me to argue that Arthur Fuller left a noticeable mark on the history of the United States. And yet, for me, he emblematizes nicely a certain shift in values that his country experienced in his time. Arthur Fuller was a clergyman very near to the last moment when the influence of a religious figure in America could be as strong as that of a leading business person or politician. While serving his regiment, Fuller published a volume of inspirational army hymns and melodies. He instituted a temperance society in the ranks and established a Sunday school and choir in his regiment. He worked hard at the impossible task of Christianizing the war. His final act, in which he set aside the tools of peace and carried a gun across the Rappahannock, can be read, I would suggest, as a kind of admission of the superiority of force over docile persuasion. Interestingly, Arthur Fuller's greatest influence on American history came not through his deeds, but through his DNA. His posthumously born grandson was the inventor and futurist Buckminster Fuller. So there, in brief, are the major figures whose stories are told in A Worse Place Than Hell. In my work on this book, these five have come to life for me as heroes and as friends, separated, I think and hope, more by time than by spirit and sympathy. So I'll be happy now to quiet down and listen to some comments and questions.
First of all, thank you for a very informative and interesting presentation. It's, you know, I do Civil War medicine, reenacting and lecturing, and we all have to read hospital sketches when we start to learn about the general hospitals, and also Walt Whitman and with his work in the general hospital. So, and about Holmes and all of that is just terrific. And of course, Louisa May Alcott. I think she briefly also was at Armory Square, but she got the short straw and got sent to the Union Hotel Hospital, which was one of the worst in DC. And her supervisor, Hannah Ropes, died from typhoid also. So.
Exactly right. Yeah, one of the sort of original contributions that my book makes is that I was, after 150 years of people not really knowing, I was able to actually locate and figure out who John Surrey actually was.
Oh,
yeah, because Alcott in her journal refers to him as a 30-year-old Virginia blacksmith. And so for 150 years, all of the Alcott scholars were looking for a 30-year-old Virginia blacksmith, not at all suspecting that he was from Pennsylvania and he was 21 years old. And the only reason I found that was that I was studying George Rabel's book, Fredericksburg. And he makes a tiny reference to a soldier who's been shot through the lungs and doesn't know that he's going to die, and that a nurse wrote a letter home for him. And there was a footnote to a file, the John Surrey papers, at the Carlisle, Pennsylvania Army College. So I dashed down there. Oh my gosh, do they have the letter that Louisa May Alcott wrote? It turned out it wasn't by her. It was by one of his commanding officers. But there was one letter by Surrey, and it gives his regiment and his company. And from that, the doors just opened, and I was able to find out, names of parents, names of siblings, the fact that he was in the last charge at Marie's Heights at the very end of the horrible day in Humphrey's division. So it was, for me, it was just really kind of thrilling and gratifying to find this guy. It was kind of like finding an MIA, and being able to give him his due and restore him to a little bit of cognition. So there we are.
Jim, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. So I'm wondering if our wonderful speaker could comment on Memorial Hall at Harvard, and also correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s a lunchbox is on display at the law school, and I think it's an old ammo box. Is that true?
Gosh. Wow. Okay, well, you've already done better than I can do. I frequented that library for 3 years. Not when I was interested in Holmes in particular. Never saw the lunchbox, but if you say it's there, I judge that it probably is. As far as Memorial Hall goes, I don't know if I can give anything other than an emotional reaction, because you know what it's like to walk in there. And it is, of course, among other things, a shrine to Harvard's fallen. And I certainly presume that Arthur Fuller's name is there. And what can I do more than simply to recommend a visit to Harvard Yard and to advise people to go take a look at it. I don't know what else you had in mind.
Well, I had heard that the hall was originally dedicated to the Union students who were killed.
Ah.
And then at some much later point, somehow they recognized students who had served in the Confederate Army.
Right. And of course, none other than Rooney Lee, Robert E. Lee's son, was an alumnus of Harvard, who gets a little bit of mention in the education of Henry Adams, as I recall. So very well pointed out.
When you did your research and wrote about Louisa May Alcott,
Yeah.
did you run into the when she was the chaperone of Anna Minot Weld when she did the grand tour of Europe?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And the reason I mention that is I
Yeah.
happen to be a docent at Anderson House, with Isabel Weld Perkins,
Oh, how about that? Yeah.
So that's the reason I know the story. Yeah.
Yeah, that was Louisa's first trip to Europe before she had the money to do it on her own. She also revisited Europe in 1870 and 71, right around the time of the Franco-Prussian War. But she did have this earlier excursion to Europe in 1865, 1866, as the caretaker of a partial invalid young woman by the name of Anna Weld, who was apparently not a very pleasant traveling companion, and whose apparently best feature was that she played a mean game of backgammon. So anyway, and it was on that trip that Louisa met the young Polish man,
The Polish guy, right?
right, who becomes kind of an ambiguous love figure in her life, and who is one of the inspirations for Theodore Lawrence, aka Laurie, in Little Women. And I've actually, having found John Surrey, been trying to find Ladislas Wisniewski, but it is really, really hard to do research that goes back that far in Poland, particularly if the archive was in Warsaw, because as we know, the archives did not fare especially well in the mid-1940s. So that story may be irretrievable.
Yep.
David Rosen, did I see you have a hand up? Do you have a question if you want to?
Yes, I wanted to ask first to thank you for your fine talk, and then to ask in the course of working your way to putting the book together, you ended up with 5 main characters.
Yeah.
There must have been a few others who didn't quite make the cut. And I was wondering if you might find any of those interesting and worthy of mention.
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and it's the first time anyone has asked it of me, so I thank you for it. And probably the last person who didn't make the cut was Thomas Reed Roots Cobb, who was killed at Marie's Heights on December 13th, a Confederate officer from Georgia, brother of Howell Cobb, I believe, who wrote, as you may know, a pre-war treatise on the history of the law of slavery, which makes for some rather fascinating reading. So I was very, very close to having some attention paid to Thomas Cobb, but finally could not quite squeeze him in. And as you may know, editors these days often are not quite as concerned with the prose as they are with the length. And so there's talk about how many pages you can publish and what the price point will be, and so on and so forth. And so that unfortunately was another reason that I had to cut that out. My selections of the 5 were in some ways fortuitous, but it's actually quite interesting that the 5 people I selected were connected with stories that I could, basically I could follow these 5 people through everything that I wanted to say about Fredericksburg. If I wanted to talk about the street fight on the 11th, I had the 20th Massachusetts, and I had Arthur Fuller. For Pelham's stand at the beginning of December 13th, I had that. Then later in the day, I have George Whitman, charging basically up the middle toward Marie's Heights, and then I've got John Surrey a little bit more to the north on the battlefield. So it really worked out beautifully in that regard. I could narrate the battle in the way that I wanted to, just through telling the stories that I had in mind. But the choice of the 5 really stems from just the various interests that I've had throughout my lifetime. When I was 12 or 13, I was captivated by John Pelham, and he just seemed to be the most dashing, heroic person I'd ever read about. And so I went on a real Pelham kick when I was a kid. And then, of course, I went to law school, so there's the interest in Oliver Wendell Holmes very much baked in. And I've written the book about Louisa May Alcott. I've written the book about Arthur's sister, Margaret, and Whitman has always been kind of in the background of my interest. So really, this book is kind of a culmination, a coming together of various figures who have intrigued and excited me over the course of my lifetime. So in that sense, I do kind of feel that if there's a sort of destiny to these things, and if there was a book that I was meant to write, this is probably it. So I hope I did okay with it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good question, David. I see Leland has your hand up. Leland, if you'd like to ask a question.
Regarding the fact that Oliver Wendell Holmes, when he was corresponding with his father, he talked about being on the verge of a breakdown. And it seems like he had been serving as a soldier for years on end. I mean, just how long a term of service did he sign up for?
Yeah, he signed up for 3 years, thinking like everybody else that the war was never going to last that long. And his experience of the war is one of getting wounded, getting sent home, coming back, getting wounded again, getting sent back home, getting wounded a third time. He's just back and forth, almost like a pinball, between the 20th Massachusetts and the home front in Boston. And in fact, his service almost comes to an end after what's called the Battle of Second Fredericksburg, which is kind of that tail end action connected with the Battle of Chancellorsville. Because there he's shot through the ankle, or in the heel rather, and the wound seems to be the least serious of those that he's had. He's shot through the chest at Ball's Bluff. He's shot through the back of the neck at Antietam, but those two heal relatively fast, and he's back in action, reasonably quickly. But he is taken out of the fight so long after Second Fredericksburg that he starts to have very serious worries about the kind of reception he'll get when he comes back, because he's very concerned that people will look at his long absence as being a period of malingering and mild cowardice, what have you. And his very good friend Henry Abbott talks him really into coming back and saying, no, you don't understand, Wendell. Everybody here knows exactly how brave you are, and you're not going to face any criticism of that nature at all. Now, he ends up not going back to the 20th because of a bureaucratic screw up, and he ends up actually as a staff officer for one of the higher ups. But anyway, so his story is one of sort of it's 3 years of service, but it's interrupted by these long periods of convalescence.
Very interesting talk. Thank you very much, John. A question I have is,
Great.
it seems as though at least 3 of these, but maybe a lot of other ones that we've heard about too, is we have persons who have experienced medical care, being
Yes.
in the hospitals, attending to the wounded,
Yeah.
that have written some pretty amazing stories. And is there some connection? Is there something about that experience that brings out these types of stories that you may not see, or at least are not written about by others?
Yeah, the book conceptually does kind of rest on 2 pillars that might be described as courage and compassion. And of course, those are not distinct categories. There's a lot of overlap between the courageous person and the compassionate person. But the book is divided, my volume is divided into 5 subsections, and the last 2 after Arthur Fuller dies are called two nurses and two soldiers. And one of the things that I really wanted to bring out in the book was a theme of illness and healing, not only on the part of the individuals in the book, but also in terms of the country in general. Gideon Wells in his diary talks about the grave national illness. And so that metaphor of disease is one that is embedded in the literature as well, independently of I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I got a little distracted by the chat. I apologize. But it's kind of, anyway, I'm not going to finish that sentence because I don't know how I started it. But anyway, you get the gist of it.
Well, let me follow up. I hope you don't mind my saying this. I haven't read your book yet, but I'm looking forward to getting it. But it sounds as though you have an interesting perspective from all sides of the war. And I hope you don't mind my saying this, but since you were born in California,
a free state, yep,
and lived in North Carolina or went to school in North Carolina,
yeah,
and then of course we're up in New York, going to Harvard and Columbia. You've experienced a perspective of the objective one from California, because I was born in the state of Washington. We didn't even study the Civil War, and I lived in California. It wasn't until I moved to Virginia in 71 that I learned about the Civil War, but by then it wasn't really that we were beyond teaching that in high school. But you have the perspective of the various perspectives, the North, the South, and the West.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And those various experiences, I think, have informed the way in which I approach the work that I do. It's not the most fashionable thing in the world to say two nice words about a Confederate at the current moment, but my experience of studying and understanding the Civil War goes back to the time that I was an early adolescent. And although I was living in California, my father worked for an airline. He worked for United. And so I was, with my parents, able to go on a lot of really wonderful historical field trips. And my parents had a particular fondness for Virginia. They were, in fact, married in Alexandria, and their remains are interred in Alexandria now. And so I had much more of a hands-on exposure to East Coast American history than really any of my friends, and also my parents, well they were Midwesterners by origin. They were from my dad was from Minnesota, my mother was from Wisconsin, and they subscribed to a kind of and pardon the characterization, but this sort of Midwestern ethic that it was very important in your house to have the trappings of culture. You had good books on the shelves, even if you didn't read very many of them. You had a piano in your living room, even if nobody was especially good at playing it. And so I was fortunate enough to be raised in an atmosphere for whom the world didn't begin with James Dean's first movie or the Ed Sullivan Show with the Beatles or what have you. And so this actually really worked to my advantage when I was in graduate school, because when we studied 19th century American figures and other people were sort of wrestling with the vocabulary and the ideologies and so forth, it was like current events for me. It really just kind of clicked. I mentioned before the meeting began that my sister is, she's the curator of photographs at the National Portrait Gallery, and her real focus also is the 19th century. So both my sister and I spend so much time in the 19th century. It's a wonder we haven't both gotten consumption. It's probably a greater hazard to us than COVID. But anyway, that's a little bit of my background as far as that goes.
Well, Gary Gallagher grew up in Colorado, so it's not a prerequisite.
Okay.
Speaking of one thing, I have to point out, Bill Binzel has a great library back there, and and your two books back there we talked about earlier today, the 2-volume set right behind you to the right there, Bruce Caton's 2-volume set there, and you speak highly of him, and a lot of us know that he was one of our founding members for our Civil War Roundtable.
Yeah, absolutely. Bruce Catton was one of the first Civil War writers whom I read. He and Douglas Southwell Freeman, and I think that if a reader pays close attention, they'll see some of the influence. Not that I was trying to imitate Catton, because that's a vain exploit. He's head and shoulders above so many, but his great gift, I think, was the precision of a scholar combined with a novelistic sensibility in his prose. And that's probably most on display in A Stillness at Appomattox, but the man knew how to tell a story. And I come to biography really as a frustrated novelist. I can't come up with original characters or plots to save my life, but if you lock me in an archive with some journals and letters, then I can tell you a story. So that's how I do it.
Catton was the second president, I think, of this group. And he Freeman, I know, spoke to the roundtable.
Wow.
Speaking about trying to tell a story, I want to put a plug in for the work you're doing now on the screenplay, if you don't mind, John. If you
Oh, sure. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. As I was finishing up A Worse Place Than Hell, I showed drafts of it to a friend of mine who was also a Civil War enthusiast and someone who has a little bit of a background in screenwriting. And so something we've been doing on the side is we've been gradually writing a multi-episode script that one hopes would be a miniseries on Netflix or one of the other web platforms that is a lightly fictionalized version of A Worse Place Than Hell. And boy, is that fun, because I finally get to write fiction and to explore and expand on character in a way that doesn't completely tie me to the journals and letters. And so we're not venturing too far afield, but we are having just a wonderful time with it.
Well,
wow, that'd be terrific.
Well, so if there's anybody out there who knows a producer, please drop my name.
The other thing I've heard is that the entire time that Holmes was on the Supreme Court, he kept his Civil War uniform in his closet in his chambers.
That is correct, with the bullet. Yep.
And he was active in the GAR, so he got over the soldier thing.
Yeah, it's very interesting because when he's in the war, he writes these almost desperate letters home, saying we're dying like pigs and men are going mad. But after it's over, and he has some perspective on it, and it takes him a while, but after about 20 years or so, he begins to understand that to have been touched by fire, which is his famous phrase about that, was an irreplaceable experience and a valuable experience, and one that not only shaped him, but established for him his understanding of what life really means. And I'll actually read a paragraph to you. I have it right here from one of his post-war speeches. This is 20 plus years, I believe, after the war ends. He says, "I do not know what is true. I do not know the meaning of the universe. But in the midst of doubt, in the collapse of creeds, there is one thing I do not doubt, that no man who lives in the same world with most of us can doubt, And that is that the faith is true and adorable, which leads a soldier to throw away his life in obedience to a blindly accepted duty, in a cause which he little understands, in a plan of campaign of which he has no notion, under tactics of which he does not see the use. And I used that paragraph in my book, not only to illustrate this complete sea change of his attitude, but also to kind of offer Holmes as possibly, a proto-existentialist, someone who says that the real value of life is of seeing its absurdity and its impossibility, but embracing that absurdity and impossibility and continuing to march on in the face of seemingly certain destruction. And it's a passage. What I just read to you is something that I think a lot of people would be aghast at. What do you mean that it's lovely or that it's beautiful to make that kind of sacrifice? And yet, Holmes said it was one of the most undeniable things in human experience. It's really, to me, it's extraordinarily moving and fascinating.
Sounds like Heidegger. Bill, did you had your mic open? Did you have a question, Bill Binzel?
I did. And John, as a resident of Alexandria, Virginia, I just wondered where it was your parents lived, where they're interred. And I asked that as also a native of the Midwest. I grew up in Ohio, went to undergrad in Michigan and also Wisconsin. So I think we share some common roots here.
Great. Yeah, and I'm gonna let you down a little bit because I don't remember the name of the street that this burial ground is on, but it is a burial ground that is, I believe, now dedicated to military veterans. My dad was an officer in the Navy, and it's a little bit of a drive out from downtown. It's not terribly far from the Masonic Memorial. So I don't know if that rings enough bells with you. It's across the street from a very new apartment complex. Was new probably 20 years ago. Still strikes me as new now. But I don't know if that if you set me down and said take me to it, I could do it, but I can't give you addresses or things like that.
Braddock Road?
Is it off Duke Street? Or?
Yeah, it is off Duke Street. Yeah, sort of the upper reaches of Duke Street. Yeah,
I think I know where you're talking about.
I do too, I think.
Yeah, and there's a Whole Foods very near it.
Cemetery.
Alexandria National Cemetery.
Exactly.
Okay, well, there we are. Yeah, so that's where my parents' ashes are. And my sister lives on Orinoco Street in the 800 block.
Well, John, do you want to wrap up? I guess we do want to also mention kind of a segue. You experienced Pelham growing up, and Ty Sidgewell, General Sidgewell, I don't know how you pronounce his name, grew up honoring Robert E. Lee, and so he's going to be talking as the last speaker of this operational year on June 22nd, I believe it is.
Yeah, well, he's got a lot of more play now because he's named the head of the commission about the renaming of the bases. The ones who are named after Confederate generals.
Went to Episcopal High School and had a significant spiritual change in this about whether we make Robert E. Lee a saint or what.
Well, that's his book, but his latest thing is he's in charge of that commission about renaming the bases. I mean, who would name a thing after Bragg anyhow?
That should be
Probably, yeah, that one is a head scratcher.
The commission is Admiral Howard, the first female 4-star admiral to lead a combat fleet. So Seidel is on the committee, but Admiral Howard is head of the committee.
That's correct.
Oh, okay. I thought he was the head of the committee. He's on. I know he's on.
No, he's on the committee. General Seidel's probably greatest immersion with Robert E. Lee was going to Washington and Lee University, which is going through their own throes of dealing with their legacy. and the mystique, if you may, of the lost cause and Robert E. Lee. It's a story that's unfolding right now. And even the question of whether or not Washington and Lee should be renamed. So stay tuned.
Mhm.
Yeah, he's sworn in, right? With Robert E. Lee lying there, basically.
He sits on the altar.
Yeah.
Well, John, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
That
I
was terrific.
and we all do. And we will.
Yeah,
get
I'm about halfway
recording.
through the book.
Thank you, John. Well done.
All
Thank
right.
you very much.
Cheers and thank you
And
very much.
thank you, everyone, for attending also.